My conference is Synodality in Latin America, and the formulation of the topic, it already gives a link or a connection on synodality in the subcontinent and the first Ecclesial Assembly. It doesn't drop from the sky, but it emerges as a fruit of a path towards an awareness and practice ever more synodal in our church in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would like to focus my contribution in some central aspects of the Latin American Caribbean Bishop Conferences as the Amazon Synod. I will name the aspect that I consider to be important to take awareness, and that I consider it to commit to work to fragmentation and great groups, large groups of the society that are reflected in the church, and that needed to be faced and transformed to be able to be a church, people of God that walk together in the faith. Without using the term synodal, from Medellin, we can observe paths in Latin America and the Caribbean to be able to achieve ever more walking in communion, people of God walking together. The Latin American Episcopate Conference in Medellin in 1968, when translating the process of the reception, the richness of the newness of the Spirit fostered by the Second Vatican Council in the context in Latin America, clearly identified the situation of the great gaps, social gaps in societies in Latin America, and the exclusion of many poor men and women living in human conditions as a cause of structural injustices, as great interpolation and a scandal in the light of the faith. As it called the church to a profound conversion. This was expressed in a decisive option for the poor, and that option was made in light of the gospel. The following conferences, the Conference of Puebla, Santo Domingo, and Aparecida, confirmed this option, creating, issuing, and deepening in different aspects of sub-option when embracing and translating the ecclesiology of the people of God to reality. They acknowledge the need for a profound conversion as church to be able to overcome the exclusion of the poor, which is a contradiction of the values of the kingdom of God, and walking together with the poor to be a church from them and in communion with them. To begin the challenged and difficult process of being a church for the poor. Current in this moment, Pope Francis, he said is very strong in to foster this in our church, calling us to be a church going forward to the peripheries, geographical peripheries, cultural, social, and existential. The option for the excluded and discarded for the people on the peripheries must be an essential characteristic of a synodal church. And the Conference of Puebla, they talk about the situation of poor women, confirming what they're suffering a double oppression, meaning being poor and being women. It also, we raise our voices against the situation of the native peoples when stressing that are the poorest among the poorest. And we take conscience, we are aware of the youth that are part of the largest group of the population in general, whom live in poor and misery conditions. Therefore, in Puebla, the Latin American Caribbean Church takes a preferential option for the youth, which is the generation of an option for the poor. In another significant step to include the This group of the population being aware and in a preferential in the pastoral of the church as to the women at the Latin American Caribbean Episcopate Conference in Santo Domingo, where they first talk about a, a more extensively on the problematic of machismo, in the different injustices and violences that women are suffering because of it. It is reflected on the language and gestures that are often offensive towards women in the church, within the church, and on the need to include more women in the different areas of the church. Aparecida talks about and on its final document of the new subjects, and it calls them as such women, youth, and native people. The term subject means there are people with reflection, with voice, with ability of their own actions. Aparecida values and stresses also on the important role of the small ecclesial communities and base communities. It stresses or emphasizes that the baptism, that we're all missionary disciples, that we are called to give testimony of our faith and be active and committed members in our churches that is formed by everyone. In this context, Aparecida already strongly criticizes clericalism as well as machismo, and it demands that it's given the possibilities for a larger and active participation of the laity, to confirm decisively for the preferential option of the poor to be introduced, are introduced once again in a new dimension of calling and being friends of the poor, as Pope Francis talked about Fratelli Tutti. I talk about social friendship, and also as Christian, we are called to foster and recognize we're all brothers and sisters. In light of this path and taking steps towards a synodal practice, it was decided in conversation with Pope Francis to create the first Ecclesial Assembly in November of the present year. And Pope has wanted that takes part of the is a part of the path towards the sign of the bishops in 2023 on synodality. At the first Ecclesial Assembly, it is also in the horizon with the encyclicals Laudato Si. So it was asked by part of the representatives of such people, by the active participation of the native peoples in the Amazon. It was formulated the demand for a profound cultural conversion that entails a decolonization of our relationship, not only in society, but also in church. It was asked strongly asked as part of the representatives of such peoples that it should characterize their relations in a synodal church. A church in a synodal path, does not exist for itself. It is rather called to be a universal sacrament for salvation, a credible sign of a vivid or a living love, and of the living and redemptive love of God, who turns with compassion, mercy, and tenderness the injury of humankind and our sister Mother Earth. The Latin American and Caribbean First Ecclesial Assembly is a new experience. The name indicates, is an unprecedented experience, and therefore a pioneer at a level of the Latin American Caribbean Church, as well as a level of the universal church level. As to the message in his video in January of the present year, the Pope stressed on that it's not only an assembly of bishops, but the entire people of God, among lay and religious brothers and sisters, seminars, priests, bishops, and every people of goodwill who would wish to participate in this process. We are all called to work together. It corresponds to the synodal spirit to create an event in an assembly, because an assembly means a meeting of its members of a constitutional body. In our case, the church, and goal is to discern together, is guided by the Spirit, to the will of God for our church in Latin America. This process is of mutual discernment and listening, and it was created 14 years. It's going to be held 14 years after the Latin American Caribbean Bishop General Conference in Aparecida, and towards the celebration of the 500 years of the Guadalupan event and 2,000 years of our redemption. A very important and essential part of all this is the listening process of the people of God, whose first stone was set on August the 30th. It's the first experience of this kind in Latin America and the Caribbean. It has invited to all the members of the people of God to contribute with their voices in personal reflections and group reflections on the document of the way, to read the signs of the times in our societies, in our church, and to contribute with their appreciations and comments about the pastoral priorities that will need to be to give answers to the signs of our times in light of the faith, to respond to the question, what are the past conversion paths, what are the new paths for which God is asking us to be. In their video, Pope Francis has reminded us, in meaning something important, that the church is given to everyone without exclusion, and it manifests in how an ecclesial assembly is put together as a credible and truthful sign of it. Pope Francis, in his discourse for the 50th celebration of the institution of the sign of a bishop, stressed that the church of the third millennium is called to be a synodal church, that the synod in the Amazon was a clear awareness for the need of profound conversion towards synodality, that is not only in theory but also in practice. Synodality is acknowledged or recognized as a constitutive dimension of our church. It is recognized with humbleness that it's like a conversion. There's a conversion of attitudes and practices for authoritarianism, and that it requires this overcoming on clericalism and the arbitrary impositions. We are called to create a culture of synodality. The first Latin America that embraces the learnings and inspiration of the Synod of the Amazon, particularly to add the usual method of the Latin American and Caribbean Church, in meaning to see, to enlighten, and to act, and the element of listening, to see and listening. It means a listening of people of different social contexts, cultural, religious, meaning listening to the earth and its cry. It is about a comprehensive listening that covers intellectual dimension, and it is a constitutional part or essential part of a spiritual discernment. The Pope reminds us that that listening is more than hearing. Is a reciprocal in which someone learns from, has something to learn. It is very important that it is done with full conscious and awareness of the gift of the spirits, because we all have been given the Spirit as members of the people of God in baptism and confirmation, and therefore we are called to practice a core responsibility for our church. An ecclesial assembly, it is called to be open in community to the Spirit, and to be disposed to perceive its voice, inspiration, in prayer, and mutual listening, and in respectful diversity. In the listening processes, in light of the first ecclesial assembly, in light of the preferential option for the poor, great efforts were made in the diverse local churches to get to people and groups in the social, cultural, and existential peripheries. That was not easy because of the limiting condition imposed by the pandemic. One of the limiting factors was the fact that many people and communities in the periphery do not have what's needed to participate in digital communication, or they have it, but it is very restricted. It was impressive for me to observe creativity, mainly from the youth, to enable that in many ways these the voices of people in the peripheries are collected, so they are present in the listening process with their own contributions. Pope Francis, knowing this a limiting factor of the listening process in an assembly during this time of pandemics, in spite of that, he wanted anyways for this assembly to be held for this in these months, so it contributes its experience and learnings of synodality to the deliberations and discernments in preparation for the sign of bishops on synodality. To address the um, the comments of the Pope, the warnings of the Pope, of that an assembly not to be a separated elite of the people of God, certainly SILAM, it is safe making sure that there is a proportional representation of the different sectors of our church, lay, religious brothers and sisters, seminar, people in the seminars, priests and bishops, and make sure that it's an appropriate number of women that participate, and that their participation is enabled also for the people of goodwill with their observations, comments, suggestions. They can help the church in the discernment of its mission. Living the process with audacity of the Spirit. At the same time, it is of great importance that its synodal process is lived towards this synodal process towards the Ecclesial assembly is the process with audacity of the Spirit. Let us remember that first, that those who were called by Jesus, one of the calls that is very common, or we see very often to his disciples, is do not be afraid, because the Spirit, creative, it just blows. It is wherever he wants. It, it asks from us to be open, not trying to control, but allowing something new to emerge as fruit of the creative action of the Spirit. For it's and a synodal process demands for each one of us to live behind, to be a, available, and to leave behind our attachments, fragmented visions, and our judge, prejudice, prefabricated ideas, and attachment to power. It is about conversion of the heart of mind. It calls us to open to the sensus fide, to the smell in the matters of the faith of the people of God, and it is manifested in the multiple contributions in the listening process, where mainly we can see many coincidences and affirmation about matters of the faith and pastoral priorities, as well as ways to read and interpret the signs of our times, seeking to live trail of the presence of God in our reality. The approximation of these contributions require a very careful listen and open listening, because one is standing on sacred land. That is valuable. This is valuable for the systematization process of the information received, and also when elaborating or issuing a document that might serve the assembly for its deliberations, and for the assembly itself. The attentive or careful listening and open listening to the diverse voices of the conscious is also a different opinion of mine that maybe I do not share, but it is important to seek what truth it contains, or what cry it expresses in it. As to the sensus fide, we need to see that Thomas Schuller and other experts in canon law, they, since a long time, they had been trying to interpret this theological concept to be translated into linking binding regulations of the canon law. As to the reference of the process and to identify it as also to recognize the value of its matter and content. We also need to, from the beginning of the synodal path towards the first ecclesial assembly, we have stressed a lot and the listening, continuous listening of the process, and this listening must be practiced in the assembly, must continue after this to create a synodal culture, and it requires to be held in coordination. The identification of the sensus fide, it needs to be expressed in concrete actions to implement. It is important to learn what happened after the process, in the process after Aparecida. In Aparecida were many pastoral theological proposals, very innovative and valuable, that were not implemented, and that it makes us ask this question: what did we miss? What is missing? And what do we need to do now in order for those proposals to be taken on and taken to practice? We need also a discernment phase that implies also an evaluation moment and a commitment towards the following steps. In the synodal process, we will need to make sure that the listening is taken to action, it has an effect, it is transforming, it changes, and also is in effect. In this context, this question asks, how in canon law there's only one bishop, sign of bishops, and why is there not at this moment an ecclesial assembly? Then what is the authority of such assembly? Their decisions, can they be binding? And before this question, it is important to take into account, for example, the authority of the Latin American Bishop Conference in Medellin, that the decisions and the options taken have had great authority in the faith for many faithful. And the authority, does not depend in the first place of a judicial binding, but on the contrary, it determines the Christian community in its reception, the put into practice of this martyrdom. Certainly, Medellin was a water, divided water divisor, and many acknowledge its authority because of its prophetic testimony until the rendering of its life, as given as expressed and in its reception. In this way, sensus fide was the preferential option of the poor, that it emerges from the gospel that was assumed by the universal church as an option to assume and put into practice in the following of Jesus. At the same time, the question for the authority of an ecclesial assembly, not an episcopal, it raises another question. The question about the power of the bishops and how to understand this. Many experts in canon law, for example, Thomas Schuller and Sabine Demel, indicate that it is true that according to the canon law, bishop has ex officio, the power to decide on matters and of discernment and deliberations on different matters of the government of the church. And it's equally true, equally right, that in that power, the canon law, it's given by the canon law, it could be decided with total freedom and to be able to exercise such power, considering the spirit and synodal practice as binding for him, and then create in his government the structures, instances, and needed media for such purpose. It is important to remember that in the ancient church, at the beginning, it was that concerns to all. It needs to be decided by all. A principle that is deeply synodal, and it should be important to recover. Also, bishops can foster a larger participation of the laity, religious brothers and sisters, particularly women, in options on posts for government leadership in the local churches that do not need ordaining in the ministry. The Pope is given a clear example in the government of the Vatican. It's been a while that Cardinal Walter Casper demanded that it to seriously think on the appointment of women as cardinals, since the official this uh, title as cardinal does not demand ordainment to the ministry, as the history of the church shows. And in the process of listening, it was reflected in several forums on the topic of a possible deaconship for women in our church. That seems significant for those who would like to who participated in one of the forums that that made it to give their contributions to reflection and to contribute in that way to the work of the commission stated by the Pope to investigate on the topic. It is about a synodal way of proceeding. Before clericalism, it is from the priests, but also from the laity as well, and religious brothers and sisters, how to understand the power of bishops and priests. Well, to move forward down the path towards a true synodal church, it is essential the use of power in the church, and in particular in power of those with priest and bishop ministries that have more influence, and it is directed towards established criteria by Jesus, that is, that to have Jesus as a principal reference and a way of understanding and practicing power. Jesus puts power at the service of the kingdom of God and reminds his disciples that among them, their brothers and sisters, there's an equal to equal relation, working together in faith. When making a spiritual synod a part of the synodal spirit, it demands from us great openness to the spirit of Jesus, that it wants to lead us through by renewal paths. A new life for the church entails also openness to new mysteries that can emerge from the church, that are already emerging for the good of the entire people of God and its mission, to enable a larger participation of all the faithful in the mission of the church, in discernment and in the process of decision making. It means to embrace and more fully the synodal spirit. Ordained ministries can use their power to create new spaces and new and common spaces for discernment and participation in the decisions to move towards the spirit of synodality. Let us be reminded by the words of St. Paul. Let us not pretend to domain their faith in contributions to your joy, because you are faithful in the faith. Let us walk together. I would like to, as stressed by Carlos Chickendance, the reforms constitute an obedience to the Spirit. And I would like to conclude with some words from Pope Francis containing his letter to the people of God that he wrote back in 2018. It is impossible to imagine a conversion of the ecclesial action without the active participation of the members of the people of God. Even more, every time that we have tried to ignore, to reduce, to silence the little elites of the people of God, we build communities, plans, theological accentuation, structure, and spirituality with no roots, without memory, without a face, without a body, definitely without life. As stressed and highlighted by Pope, this is expressed in the different forms of abuse of power, such as clericalism. This attitude is not only nullifies the personality of the Christian, but also has a tendency to diminish and devalue the baptismal grace that the Holy Spirit bestowed on the heart of our people. Say no to abuse. We can add to say a yes with conviction, profound conviction to synodality, meaning with energy, saying energy no to any form of clericalism. Let us help each other in this moment of grace for the Latin American Caribbean Church to overcome clericalism and to contribute with joy to create a synodal culture in our church, so there is our people really truly have life in Jesus, and all of us as part of them. Thank you.